Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one online platform for creatives. In the world of film photography, there's nothing quite like the experience that comes with using a TLR camera. But if you're in the market for one, there's a number of options out there, and it can be a bit of a confusing process trying to figure out which one's right for you. So I rounded up two of the more popular and common cameras out there, the Yashica Mat 124G and the Rolleicord V. And in this video today, I'm gonna go out, do some shooting with both of these cameras, compare them, and talk about which one I'd choose if I could only pick one. I've owned the 124G for a few years now. It's one of my favorite cameras. I did a review on this channel not that long ago, but I've always kind of eyeballed the Rollies, and I came across this Model V recently for a really good price. Decided to grab it to add to my collection, and then also figured it could be helpful to do a comparison video like this. So I spent a couple days shooting with the Rollie, and then I went out for one day with both cameras just to shoot them side by side. So we're gonna break this video down into a few categories, and the first thing we'll start with is just talking about the build and the handling. So when it comes to the size of these cameras, they're very similar. The Yashica though is a little bit taller and a little bit wider, weight similar, and really it's kind of splitting hairs. You know, there is a difference, but they both feel very similar in the hands. The Rollie though, obviously this isn't a Rollie Flex, but the cords still have a reputation for their build quality and their preciseness, whereas the Yashica doesn't have that same reputation to it. And I will say, you know, the Rolleicord feels very nice. Everything on it's metal, so the focusing knobs, the film release knobs are all metal. It feels very smooth, and you know, this camera is I think like 70 years old, and you know, it's withstood the test of time. I can't see any reason why this wouldn't, you know, last for another 50, 60, 70 years. So the build quality on this camera feels super nice, whereas the Yashica, it's not that it feels bad, but when you compare the two, you know, the Yashica Mat has some plastic parts to it, so the focusing knob, some of these film release knobs are plastic as well. This one's kind of sticking. This top plate is plastic. So again, not that it's bad, but if you were putting them side by side, I would certainly give the edge to the Rollie. It feels a little bit nicer, a little bit smoother, and a little more well-built. Next up is looking at how these cameras operate, and that is where they start to differ a little bit. So the Yashica has a crank on the side of the camera, right-hand side, which advances the film, and then you got your focusing knob on the left-hand side of the camera. And the Rollie is quite a bit different, whereas it has both on one side of the camera, but it has a knob to advance the film, and then the focusing knob is on the same side. So not that one is better than the other, it's really just gonna be kind of personal preference. For me, the Rollie felt a little strange, but obviously just because I'm used to working with this camera. But when it comes to the shutter release, that's where the Yashica won me over easily. So the Rollie here has this shutter release lever, I guess you could call it, and you basically push it to the right and that cocks the shutter, and then you push it the opposite direction and it fires. And I found this a little bit kind of fiddly and awkward. I had to use my left hand, which I didn't really enjoy. Whereas the Yashica, when you wind it, it actually cocks the shutter at the same time, and then you just have this button down here to fire the shutter, which is really nice, and you can actually lock it as well. It has a little tab there if you want to lock it. So definitely some differences between the two when it comes to handling and operation. One isn't worse than the other. It's just really going to come down to whichever style fits you the best. So next up, we're going to talk about the Viewfinder, which is really the biggest difference for me between these two cameras. But before we do that, I just want to take a quick moment to talk about the sponsor of this video today, which is Squarespace. So I've been using Squarespace for a number of years now. They've saved me constant headaches and frustrations trying to do code and figure out all these other things. And what I love about them is just obviously the ease of use, but also the variety and the high quality results. Their wide range of templates allows me to create something as simple as a portfolio website for my photography, but then they have some that are a little more complex, like the template that I used for my podcast website, where I can have episode pages and even sell t-shirts and other merch. Squarespace really acts as this all-in-one platform that saves me time and also gives me professional looking results. So check out squarespace.com today for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, you can use the code Kyle McDougall to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Let's jump back into this and talk about the Viewfinder. The last category before we look at image quality is talking about the Viewfinder, and this is a big one for me, what really sold me on the Yashica. So when I was doing research about the Rollie, the one complaint that popped up quite often is just how dark the Viewfinder is. And a lot of the times it seemed people were installing third-party aftermarket bright screens. And I will say, as soon as I got this camera, it's the first thing that jumped out at me is just how dark it actually is. And it's kind of awkward to use and not that enjoyable. Whereas the Yashica, on the other hand, is noticeably brighter and quite a bit better. So this is the Yashica Mat on the left. You can see it's pretty nice and bright. And then when we go to the Rollie, you can see that it's really just kind of the center of the ground glass that has any brightness to it. It really falls off on the edges. We'll go back to the Yashica. You can see it's nice and bright kind of all across the entire frame. So quite a bit nicer to use. So there is definitely the option of installing an aftermarket screen. I think Rick Olson might be his name. He still makes some. I believe they're around like $80, $85 US. So it is an added cost to this camera, but if you bought this and you enjoyed everything else about it, in my opinion, it would be a worthwhile upgrade. So lastly, we're gonna talk about image quality. And I did shoot some side-by-side images with these two cameras to see if there were any standout differences. We'll start by looking at color and contrast, and I did try and keep things as consistent as possible, shooting Portrait 400 in both cameras at the same time and then scanning and using the same settings for conversion between images. But it is still always going to be difficult to judge those details when you're working with color negative film and scanning it. So what I really wanted to see is if there was anything that stood out. And what I found out is that, there were no drastic differences between these two cameras and how they rendered color. So, the Rollie didn't render, say, red completely different than the Yashica or anything like that. And overall, both cameras were actually very consistent and very close in terms of the look that they provided. So when it comes to detail and sharpness, again, tough to really kind of pick at details with this. The point of this test wasn't to shoot like brick walls and charts and stuff. It was more real world use, but I am using drop-down magnifiers, trying to do my best to nail critical focus on each camera. And I will say both of these lenses performed very similar, and I didn't notice any major differences between the two, which really wasn't surprising. They both do soften up a little bit when shot wide open. You can see here with this picture of the Volkswagen, both images look very comparable. And even though they're a bit soft, they're still more than usable. When you stop them down though, both lenses sharpen up quite a bit. And what was really interesting is in a few images, the Rollie actually looked a little bit better. And then in others, the Yashica performed just a hair better. So not sure exactly why that was, as the exposure settings were the same and the lenses were stopped down and focused near infinity. But really overall, just like with color and contrast, no major differences between the two. Both lenses are very comparable. They both perform nice. I think you could purchase either one of these cameras and it's absolutely going to be able to do what you need it to. Overall, the experience and the results that came from shooting with the Yashica and the Rollie weren't really that surprising, and they really are more alike than they are different. I'd consider both to be excellent buys for a photographer looking for their first TLR, but if I was forced to choose one of these cameras, I think it would probably come down to the Yashica just for the viewfinder, and I like the operation of it a little bit better. But if I was in the market for a TLR, and I had to go purchase one, I would probably just base it off of price, whichever one I could find for a better deal. Overall, it was fun to get out with both of these, and it just reminded me of how much I love shooting with a TLR. It's really a unique experience, and if you've never used one before, I definitely recommend trying one out.